Greetings, adventurers. This is the Lore Tome 0 reading, meant to be used for if you're on a drive, if you're working, just an easier way to absorb all the lore for our server and get you started right away. Those of you from Theseus might know that I did have a previous Lore Tome reading, and it's basically going to be the same as that. There is going to be much less gravitas this time around because, unfortunately, I'm trying to push this out as soon as possible so we can get people in games and yada yada yada. So I'm just gonna read everything straight through. I'll try to add a little bit of charisma to it, but yeah, we're just getting the lore out there, making it digestible, and hope you guys enjoy. So I'm going to start off by reading the disclaimer. The following document is recontextualized lore from the server we've branched off from Project Theseus. The following information is gained from Artemis, the Gallivanter of Ragnarok. This information is liable to change in the future with the advent of new evidence and completion of lore-focused missions within Vitanova. When said information is updated, a new lore tome will be put out containing the updated information, as well as any new information gained between the previous lore tome and the current one. With that all being said, please enjoy the first lore tome of Vitanova. The Cluster, and by extension, the creation of Vitanova. Far, far away, within the realms beyond Forgotten, where the astral that binds planets together is devoid of light and life, there exists what can only be described as a miracle in astrological biomes. A fully composed sphere consisting of over 50 planets, rotating around one star. This sphere is known as the Cluster, and would eventually house the planet now known as Vitanova. The Cluster's sphere was helmed by the 7 gods, each born of a cosmic fate, a massive event that ended with birth. It all started with the Draconic twins, the great worms Spiritus and Vescorna. While Vescorna was born at the death of a star, a black hole, Spiritus was born along with his star. Black and white respectively, it almost seemed fated that these twins would battle, but one would be surprised to know that it didn't happen immediately. In fact, the two were considered on good terms for a majority of their lives. It was balance. Vescorna became a devourer, a world destroyer. Anything to be consumed by her would be reduced to nothing, not even ash. While Spiritus had the unique power to create. Spiritus could link the Cluster to other worlds using his innate magic, which led to the first signs of life sprouting within the Cluster and earning it the reputation of becoming a hub world dimension. With Vescorna and Spiritus came 5 other gods who eventually formed the Cluster Pantheon. Somnus, the god of tranquility, was soon to follow after, conjured from the sun in which the Cluster rotates. Emerging from its flame, she awoke from her eternal slumber, intrigued by the people entering the Cluster for the first time, and urging the other gods to not intervene with their progress. For the best action, sometimes, is inaction. Wrath was born of humanity's first war within the Cluster. Some legends say Wrath was once a warlord who ascended to the throne of gods from pure vexation, while others say he was born from the anger of all mortals. Regardless of his origins, Wrath was firm in his judgment, quick to protect the Cluster from all invading evils with his magic sword, Severance. Malik, the god of joy's origins, are currently unknown. Some say he was birthed when man first drew upon cave walls, the start of artistic expression. Others say he was an invader, a god from another realm banished to the Cluster and swindled his way to the throne. Regardless of his reputation, Malik stands as the symbol of fun within the Cluster. In his eyes, if it's boring, it does not matter. When man first pocketed coins on the Cluster, Assia and Lazarus, the final gods of the Cluster Pantheon, were born. Assia created the social ladder that mortals follow, a code of sorts, the hierarchy that separates the rich from the poor. In his mind, the poor will be driven to success from envy. It is that seed of jealousy within man's mind that strives for him to do better, think smarter, talk wiser. Money, the inherent want, shall be the key to seeing great things happen in the mortal world. While Lazarus saw beauty in money itself, some even saying that he was the embodiment of collection. Even the gods don't know what Lazarus saw in the piles and piles of wealth he'd accumulated over time, but he grew infatuated. Any wealthy person, regardless of whether they had earned that wealth or were born into it, became respected by Lazarus. This respect, among other things, is what potentially started the class war that spread between planets, ultimately culminating in the cluster's downfall. The end of worlds. There was a select group of planets based around the inner rim of the cluster, composed of the first 25 or so planets that make up the sphere that the gods heavily favored. With their attention split between there and the planets of the outer rim, eventually, unbeknownst to the gods, their influence would start a class war in humanity. The planets became separated by a large metallic ring that spanned multiple light years wide. It was built using the floating scraps of an asteroid belt. The humanoids who made it called it the Athenas. The 25 planets within the Athenas ring became known as the Inner Heavens, lands composed of the wealthy and the scholarly, with astute temperatures fit for humanoid life. Its people were educated, its food was plentiful, there were little wars to be found. Meanwhile, the planets outside the Athenas rim became known as the Outer Hells. These planets were cold, dark, and riddled with crime. The people partook in acts of sin, gambling, slavery, killing, pillaging. The Outer Hells were the embodiment of everything Somnus wanted to avoid. Perceiving the suffering of all humans at the hands of her own pantheon, she drafted a proposal to all members, an act of inaction. The Pact of Abstinence was an ordinance filed by all 7 gods. They were to all be put into an eternal slumber, similarly to what Somnus had done to herself many, many years ago. The gods would only awaken if their awakening condition would be met. Should that happen, the god will be free to awake from their slumber, deal with the issue at hand, then guide themselves back to eternal rest. For example, Spiritus would awaken should the cluster face a sphere-destructing threat, while Viscorna would awaken after humanity commits a great sin and needed to be purged. Reluctantly, all gods agreed to the Pact of Abstinence, and thus they went to sleep. However, all of that changed when the people of the Outer Hells committed the great sin needed in order to awaken Viscorna. It's currently unknown why these humanoids committed the Viscornan blood ritual, a sacrifice that requires the offering of 10,000 humans. But for whatever reason, be it that they grew tired of the inner heavens or they were coerced into it, Viscorna was awoken. Her hunger fierce, unending, she yearned for blood. Viscorna tore into the Outer Hells, cracking the planets with her gigantic maw and leaving it nothing but space. Save for a few surviving bits of planetary debris, perhaps even a planet or two, the Outer Hells was completely destroyed. Viscorna then set her sights on the Athenas, before finally being stopped by Spiritus, who had met his awakening condition. Spiritus couldn't believe his eyes, that someone he'd once considered a friend would go to this level of destruction, but he knew what he had to do. He couldn't let his pride get in the way of doing the right thing any longer. And so, a battle of great worm twins ensued, the shockwaves of which could be felt for light years away. Some say the battle lasted years, others say decades. Viscorna was severely wounded, but was nevertheless victorious, killing Spiritus and sending his body towards a planet formerly known as Elabora. In his final moments, Spiritus' magic surged throughout his body, creating a constantly active source of wild magic in the form of his very own corpse. While his body lay adrift in space, his intention was that adventurers from other worlds would be summoned by the portals he'd unintentionally create, giving way for the mortals to defeat Viscorna and finish what he started. In the aftermath of the destruction, a Warforged was put to sleep on the 42nd planet within the Outer Hells. Known as Vitanova, the planet was known for having an abundance of portals, an unnatural abundance for a planet within the Outer Hells at least. A great mind from one of these portals, a man known only by the name he signed in his research journals, the Tinkerer. He was the creator of a Warforged named 4T2, or 4T for short. She was designed to be a guide for immigrants, a cleric to those coming from broken worlds. Alas, her creation was overshadowed by the hills burning with fire and asphalt quaking from storms. The apocalypse had neared. 4T was damaged, but was stowed away from the destruction in hopes that someday she may be able to aid people in the future and act as the guide she was always meant to be. But in damaging herself, 4T questioned her own purpose. She could recall small bits and pieces of the world she used to come from, but nothing more. She had become nothing but a husk of wills from the forgotten past, the last remnant of a man who wanted nothing more than to help the lost. Meanwhile, a young tinkerer named Artemis from the planet Elabora became the first and only humanoid to happen upon Spiritus' corpse. An artificer by trade, Artemis began conducting experiments on the corpse to figure out its arcane properties. He feasted upon it, gaining a semblance of immortality, but more importantly, Artemis carved the corpse of organs and bone to create a spelljammer he named Ragnarok. Now left to roam the cluster, searching for answers among an endless void, Artemis has compiled everything he knows into a single file, the Artemis Tome. This is that document. He believes there's only one way to stop Viscorna, who currently is slowly but surely regaining her strength. To save the rest of the cluster, Artemis believes that the only course of action would be to find a way to awaken the rest of the gods, to raise an army composed of the forgotten pantheon. This, he believes, was why the Vitanovans were brought here, to avenge the fallen, born to a land wrought with sin, who were yet innocent, using the very gods themselves as blades. Update: obtaining severance. When the land of Vitanova was still referred to as Theseus, the Thesians met Artemis and started a quest to awaken the sleeping gods. Starting with Wrath, the Thesians learned that the only way to awaken Wrath was returning his blade, Severance, back into his hand. After retrieving both the hilt and the blade and defeating his guardian, Scrumbles, the flaming astral tiger, the Thesians returned to Wrath in order to awaken him. When Severance was returned to Wrath's hand, a surge of wild magic occurred, shaking the sphere to its core and changing reality as the Thesians knew it. Their homeland, Theseus, was ruptured in two. People disappeared. Businesses and houses vanished. The land drifted apart and shook as the core that the shard surrounded began to crack. The central oak tree that stood tall at the middle of the central shard suddenly lit ablaze in ever-burning flame. The minds of the adventurers were flooded with alternative memories. While their old memories of Theseus remained, it was almost as if they were instantly transported into an alternate timeline. What remains of the original is unknown to them. They came to learn of the land's new name, Vitanova.